his new book is anything like his last book, it's going to be a page-turner. Hampton Sides is our guest, and he's going to be in St. Louis tonight at the St. Louis County Library for a book signing and a book reading for his brand new book called In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeannette. Of course, you might remember his name, Hampton Sides. He was the one who wrote the book Hellhound on His Trail, and that, of course, was a story of James Earl Ray and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Hampton Sides, welcome back to the Big 550 here in St. Louis.
It's good to be back with you.
You got it. So I have to tell you, before we talk about this new book, your last book, Hellhound on His Trail, was such a ridiculously good book. I hope it did everything you wanted it to do.
Well, it did. It certainly kept me busy for a long time, and it's now has been optioned to be a movie. So perhaps it'll have a sort of a second life in that respect.
Please tell me you're going to write the screenplay for it.
So far, no. I just write these histories. I don't write screenplays, but I'm an advisor, a consultant, and
that's good.
Just want to make sure that it's historically accurate.
And we should, as we talked about when we had you on the show the last time, that James Earl Ray escaped from the Missouri penitentiary. While out, he then assassinated Martin Luther King in Memphis.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
There's a local connection to the story.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a local connection to one of the great, terrible stories of the 20th century. All right, your new book, In the Kingdom of Ice, you're going to be here in St. Louis tonight for a book signing and a book reading. Hook us. What's this story about?
Well, this is a story about one of the very early American attempts on the North Pole. It's a completely forgotten, but at the time, a very important, very consequential, very well-known expedition to try to reach the North Pole via the Bering Strait and the fairly recently purchased territory of Alaska. And the United States, the U.S. Navy, in combination with a very eccentric and stupendously wealthy newspaper publisher who paid for everything, launched this expedition from San Francisco in the summer of 1879. They went through the Bering Strait looking for this warm water current that was reputed to be there. Never found it, got locked in the ice, and drifted for 2 years, generally speaking, heading in the right direction towards the North Pole, when finally the enormous pressure of the ice pack crushed the hull of the ship, and the ship, the USS Jeannette, sank to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, leaving these 40 dogs, 33 men, 3 open boats stranded out on the ice with nothing to do but try to make their way to the nearest landmass, which was the central Arctic coast of Siberia. So it really just becomes a survival story, a story of really great comradeship and leadership as these men struggle over the ice and try to make it to Siberia. This is in
1879. Now, they never got to the North Pole, I'm assuming.
They did not reach the North Pole. They drifted in the ice for about 1,000 miles, terrain, part of the world no one had ever seen before. They discovered 3 islands. They smashed a bunch of completely wrong theories about what was up there and about currents and so forth. But at the point when the ship sinks in the summer of 1881, the story becomes very different. It's no longer really a story of exploration. It's a story of survival. And it's a story about holding this group of men together against all odds to reach home.
The book is called In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeannette. How do you go about, Hampton Sides, researching a shipwreck up in the Arctic Circle back in the 1880s?
Well, it's not easy to do, and that's certainly what took the lion's share of the time for me, was doing the research. I went to Russia, I went to Siberia, I went to some of the places, some of the islands that figure into the story off the coast of Siberia. I went to the Bering Strait, partly just to get a feel for what that terrain looks like, but also to meet with descendants of some of the native tribes that figure into the story, particularly a tribe called the Yakuts in central Siberia. This is a tribe that speaks the Turkish language and is not related in any way to the Inuits. And they are instrumental in saving DeLong and his men when they make landfall in Siberia. The rest of the time I just spent at the archives, mainly in Annapolis. This was a U.S. Navy expedition, and so a lot of the records ended up there at the military academy, the Naval Academy, and also at the National Archives in Washington. So it took me a long time to piece this thing together and try to understand all its different dimensions.
When was it Robert Peary who first landed on the North Pole?
Robert Peary and Matthew Henson reached the North Pole in 1909. So this is a whole generation before that. This was one of those expeditions that was studied by later explorers like Peary and certainly Shackleton in his travels in the South. Certainly studied and knew about the Jeanette. It was sort of a cautionary tale about what to do right and what they did wrong as well was studied closely, so as not to duplicate some of the dire circumstances that these guys went through.
Yeah. What was it? If it was lost to history, how did you find it?
I found it, weirdly enough, in a museum in Oslo, Norway, where I was traveling for an assignment for National Geographic magazine. There was an explorer from Oslo named Fridtjof Nansen, who's fairly well known, who tried to more or less duplicate the voyage of the Jeanette in a differently designed vessel. He knew he'd get trapped in the ice. He didn't think that he would reach any kind of open water. He knew that he would suffer this tremendous pressure of the ice pack. So he designed his ship differently and rammed himself in the ice and tried to drift just like the Jeanette did for 3 years in the hope that he would go up and over the pole. Throughout this museum in Oslo, there's references to the Jeanette expedition and to DeLong, and I just kind of filed that away, and I said, I'm an American. This is an American voyage. He speaks of it as though everyone knows about it, of course, and I'd never heard of it before. So that's a good starting point for a book, and it kept me busy for nearly 4 years.
Sure. The book is called In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeanette. Hampton Sides, our guest. He'll be in St. Louis tonight for a book signing and a book reading at the Lindbergh office there in Plaza Frontenac. So when you say it was floating, do you mean floating in liquid water, or do you mean floating in like iceberg water, and or floating in solid ice?
Yeah, it was trapped. It was imprisoned in the ice pack, never moving, except that the entire pack is moving. The pack is constantly shifting and creating pressure ridges and reconstituting itself during summer. So it was kind of, you might say it's stationary if you were just looking at a single shot, but if you were filming it over time-lapse photography, you would see that it's constantly shifting and changing, and the sounds were horrific during this 2-year period where they were drifting, as the ice is making war with itself and making war with the ship, shuddering and shrieking, and people think the ice pack is some kind of monolithic thing, but it's constantly changing. And this was the environment they were trapped in for 2 years until they finally sank. Did
you find any diaries, any personal people? I mean, it's 2 years on an ice cap with 33 men. It would drive anybody crazy.
Yeah. Well, all the survivors wrote about their experiences. There were journals. There were logbooks. Most of this stuff ended up in National Archives. During this 2-year period, you're right to suggest that they kind of slowly went mad from too much togetherness and somewhat from boredom. But DeLong was a very good leader, and he understood that he had to keep the men occupied every day, every hour. There was exercise out on the ice. There were football games. There was constant hunting expeditions. They were very successful at getting polar bear and walrus and seal. And they took hourly measurements of the ice, the condition of the ice, the thickness, water temperature, depth, barometric pressure, and so forth. So it was kind of like a floating, drifting ice station, weather station, that took all these measurements, which ended up in National Archives and now are being studied by atmospheric scientists because it offered a very, very good snapshot of the Arctic 100 some odd years ago.
How did they stay warm?
Mainly furs. I mean, this is certainly well before Gore-Tex, well before parkas, modern parkas, and all the equipment that we have. But they stopped in Alaska and requisitioned a huge amount of furs, which they turned into fur suits. They weren't exactly cold. They had a lot of coal on board. They were able to stay warm through those winters. They also had Edison's lights on board. They were trying to light up the North Pole, and unfortunately, Edison had just invented his lights, and they had a lot of bugs in the system, and it didn't work in the end. But
how close did they get to the North Pole?
Not that close. They worked their way about 1,000 miles in the right direction, but they were still about 700 miles away when the ship sank.
Wow. The book is called In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeannette. Hampton Sides is the author. And any Hollywood talk of this one? This would make a great movie.
Yeah, it's already been optioned. There's some people who really want to work with this story. It's one of the problems that a lot of these Arctic stories have is that everyone's in furs. Everyone has a beard and is in furs. So, it's hard to differentiate the different characters sometimes. But these men are on the ship. They're out on the ice. Then they're in these 3 open boats as they make their way towards the tundra. They make landfall and work their way across the permafrost tundra of northern Siberia. And they take their furs off, so you'll be able to differentiate these different characters. That seems to be the perennial problem with Arctic stories.
There you go. Hampton Sides is going to be in St. Louis tonight for a book signing and a book reading. His new book, In the Kingdom of Ice, The Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeannette. But while you're picking that book up, make sure you also pick up his last book, Hellhound on His Trail, which is a story of James Earl Ray and Martin Luther King Jr. Hampton Sides, safe travel to New York. Good luck with the book, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Good to be with you.
You got it. Back in a moment, Big 550, KT.